up your workspace in both Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop to make your process easier. Adobe Illustrator has a lot of tools and you won't be using all of them, so it's helpful to keep your favorites easily accessible. My favorite tool in Photoshop Workspace is probably Navigator, because you can look at it in a smaller scale while drawing zoomed in. This is a brief summary of how I set up my workspace. Now, let's see how I actually do it. Let's start setting up our workspace. First, I'm gonna open Photoshop. In order to modify the workspace, we'll have to create new canvas first. I'm gonna go with these dimensions. I find this size useful because later I can easily adapt it to my needs. I'll change the resolution to 300 because I might want to print this later. And I'm gonna keep color mode in RGB. Let's click Create. Now we have our canvas. So what we need to do is set up the workspace. You might need a different setup, but I'm gonna show you what works for me. First, I'm gonna move this toolbar on my left side. Now, let's modify our right side. So I'm gonna need layers for sure, but I don't like this here, so I'm gonna move it at the bottom. I'm also gonna be using colors, but I don't need channels. I might need it, but let's move this next to layers. And also paths, let's move it next to layers too. I'll also be needing this one, but I'm gonna move it right here. I'm gonna get rid of this and move it here. Now let's find Navigator. I'll click Window. Here it is. I like using this tool because the Navigator allows you to look at your artwork on a much smaller scale while working on it zoomed in, maybe. You know, like in classic drawing classes, the teachers make you look at your drawing from far away. It does the same thing, but you don't have to get up and move away. So I really like this one, and I like to keep it right here in the middle. So I'm gonna get rid of this too. I like to have my history here, so let's just make it much smaller. And I'm gonna get off this. Now we're done setting up the workspace in Photoshop. I'm just gonna save the file. Let's select Photoshop and give it a name. Let's click Save. Now we can move on to Illustrator. First step here is also creating a new canvas, but in Illustrator I'm gonna choose different sizes and I'm gonna explain why. In Illustrator, we'll have to later copy our objects and paste them into Photoshop. In order for them to be the exact same size, we'll need the dimensions here and in Photoshop to match, but in a different way. I'm gonna show it to you right now. So let's go back to Photoshop and go to Image Size. As you can see, if we change the resolution here to 72, we get these new numbers, and we're gonna create the canvas in Illustrator based on this. So let's just copy this into Illustrator settings. The resolution here does not really matter, so you can keep it 300 or change it to 72. Let's click Create. And now we have our canvas. To test that we did everything right, let's create a basic rectangle, copy it with Command+C, and then try to paste it in Photoshop. So let's click Cancel here, Command-V. We have to check Smart Object here because we want it to be editable later. I don't like to check this here, so I'm gonna uncheck it. Let's click OK, and see if it's the same size. Let's just align this to our artboard so we have it in the center. I think it's the same size. So this means that our canvases are matching perfectly. Let's delete these test rectangles and let's set up the workspace here. I'm definitely gonna use this one and I'm gonna use this one too, but let's set the other things up. So let's move this little window here and this little window here. I'm not gonna use this one, so let's close it. I'll be needing layers and artboards, of course, here. And now let's move this one in the middle. Let's move this at the bottom, and we're gonna add more. So I'm gonna need a window for stroke settings. Select stroke here. It also has gradient and transparency next to it, so that's useful too. Let's click show options and move this here. I'm gonna switch here to layers, and we're all set up. So let's go over it one more time. We have color, here we have pathfinder, align, and transform. Here we have stroke, gradient, transparency, layers, asset export. I'm gonna get rid of this one because I don't ever use it, and artboards. Now what I'm gonna do is show more options here, and here you have some options: a grayscale, RGB, HSB, SMYK, WebSafe, RGB. I'm using RGB because that's how I work right now, but if my document was in SMYK, I'd go with this one. So